And I'm going to start just with a real quick plug for GMaP. I know some of you may be familiar with us, but this is the Geographic Management of Cancer Health Disparities program. No, you can't see that because it's on the wrong screen, but well, you can see the map, right? So we have 7 region-based hubs. Ours for Region 3 is here in Albuquerque.
I'm not seeing anything, Amy, if you're
oh, you
sharing.
Can't see anything?
Mm-mm.
Okay, let me try something else. How about now?
Yep, now I see it.
Okay. So GMaP has these 7 regions, well, 6 regions. Region 1 has a north and south. But we are really here to support the cancer health disparities researchers at all levels in their career. And here is basically the things that we do for you all. We have grant writing resources, including these webinars. We do mock grant reviews. We also have a monthly e-newsletter that I hope you all are signed up for, but if you're not, please do reach out to me. I'll get you signed up. We put all kinds of things like job positions, these trainings and workshops, and funding opportunities as well in that newsletter. We have travel scholarships. If you want to go to a conference, you have an abstract or a poster you want to present, or even just to go and network with other researchers, we use these funds. Right now, we're giving about up to $2,000 in reimbursement for travel expenses and also your conference registration fees. We have an extensive network of researchers who are willing to mentor. So we do offer mentorship opportunities through our network. We maintain a webpage that you can find the webinar recordings. So the one we're doing today will be up on that webpage approximately a week after we have it. We also feature a scholar on our webpage, so you can go and check that out and see what somebody else is working on. We got a little video where they explain what they have going on right now. The next one is just our community network. All researchers, just trying to connect you with anybody who's doing something that's interesting to you or that's similar in your line of work. And then we are here to encourage the attainment of those NCI funding mechanisms, so your F, K, and R awards. So that's a little basic rundown of who GMaP is and what we do. And I want to again welcome any of you who have come on since I started. Today's webinar is about race and racism in biomedical research, and we're featuring our esteemed researcher, Dr. Naomi Nishi. And Dr. Nishi is a scholar practitioner with over 15 years in higher education. Her research focuses on issues of race, racism, and social justice in adult education. She currently serves as the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at Colorado State University. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Dr. Nishi.
Thanks so much, Amy, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm excited to be with y'all in the GMaP group again. I'm going to start us off by sharing my screen. So you should see screen that says race and racism in biomedical research. And I should also note that my pronouns are she, her, and Aya. And I will wish you all a happy Pride as we start June, which is Pride Month. So as we get started today, Amy mentioned that you can put questions in the chat at any time, But I'm also going to give you a little more information. I'm hoping that we will have a conversation today to the best of our ability and to the extent that you're comfortable. I'm going to open my chat right now while I'm thinking about it. So I have various points throughout the presentation where I will ask all of you questions or for your own insights. And when I do that, I welcome you to either type things in the chat and I'll keep my eye on it if that's how you want to participate, or you're very welcome to unmute yourself and to share verbally as well. So because I'm hoping we'll have a conversation today, I like to go through some group commitments so that we can all feel respected in the conversation and feel like we can engage fully. So in a second, I'm going to ask you all if there are any specific group commitments you'd like to add to the list. But to get us started, I'm going to suggest, how many do I have here? 6. So think as I'm going through these, if there are other group commitments that you would want us to commit to so that you feel like you can engage and feel respected in this conversation about race and racism. So some I'll suggest are, I will listen when people are talking instead of planning what I'm going to say next. And I should note that I always also use these group commitments as reminders for myself that I will also be engaging in these or committing to these guidelines as well. I will allow people time to process. I will use I statements. I will critique ideas and not people. I will accept a lack of closure. I hate to say it, but we aren't going to solve all of the problems we're going to be discussing today. So we will leave here with a lack of closure, and we will accept that and realize that this work is not done. And I will not ask somebody to represent an entire group. So I'll ask that when you're sharing, especially if you're sharing your own experiences, that you not try to represent a group, but you just share your experiences as your own. So I'm going to pause here to see if you all would add any other group commitments you'd like us to consider as we have this conversation. And again, you're welcome to unmute or put it in the chat. Okay, Amanda says these look good to her. Okay, people are saying they look good. All right, thank you for that. And I'll just say, I tend to be a person who needs more time to process. So I try to give extra quiet time when I ask you all a question, knowing that some of you may be like me, where you need a minute to think about it before you're ready to share. So with that said, if something comes to mind related to group commitments, you can jump in at any time and share them. So I also like to begin this particular conversation and this presentation with the end goal in mind, just because I don't want anyone to be confused about what we're talking about here. We're going to be talking about the way that race is used, particularly as a variable, and how it's been used historically in biomedical research and other types of research. But the end message is not that we should not include race in research. It's important, and I think you all would agree with me, it is important to consider race in research. The end game here is that we also need to be considering racism in research and how racism is at work as well. So to do that, I'm going to start with another question for all of you. I want you to share with me your definition of race. When I say the word race, what comes to mind? And I'll say that I don't need the dictionary definition here. I don't even need complete sentences. But either in the chat or if you're comfortable unmuting, share with us some words or phrases that come to mind when I say the word race. The Spanish word raza. Thank you. Race is a social construct. Yep. Thanks, Amanda.
I think when I think about race, I think about in the United States, I think about groups of people, and that it's social. It's a social construct, what we call it, but that there are also biological aspects of race that can affect our health, whether it's internally or whether it's some social pressures.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we have some race is a social construct, also biological considerations, outward, physical complexions. Yes, there's certainly ties to phenotypes when we think about race, how we understand it. Anybody else want to unmute? Claire says, I think of large groups of people also having to complete a demographic section of a form. Absolutely. That tends to be where race comes up most frequently, at least explicitly, right? Is when we have to fill out a form, we have to apply for a job or apply for a grant, and those demographic questions are always sure to be on there where we're forced to pick a box, sometimes many boxes to identify. Anybody else? Anything that you'd add to the conversation?
I think there's one more in the chat.
Thank you. Agree with social construct, yet medical world seems to make it a biological construct. Thank you, Ellen. I absolutely agree. And I'm going to use that comment as our segue. And I'm going to offer you a definition of race. Now, this is my definition, but it is based on the scholarly literature related to race. So race is a socially constructed hierarchical system of differentiating people based on physical attributes, including skin color. And then I'm going to throw in this provocative statement here at the bottom. Race is not real, but it has real consequences. So we're seeing in this definition some of the things that y'all have identified already. Namely, multiple people said this is a social construction. I'm not sure if anyone said it, but we also have to note that it's a hierarchical system. That means it matters which racial category you get put in. And one race benefits from the system of race. And I don't think I will surprise any of you to say that that is white people. It is set up to be a hierarchy where white people are on top of that hierarchy. So it does matter which race you identify with in terms of implications, particularly related to healthcare and biomedical research, as we'll be discussing. But then I've thrown this extra sentence. I've gone extra on you with this race is not real, but it has real consequences. So if race is indeed a social construct, that means it was made up. So if race was made up, who made it up and why? So I want to give you a little history on race making, and we're going to start out in Europe. So one of the first people to define racial categories was this character. And some of you may recognize Carolus Linnaeus from perhaps your botany classes in college, if you can remember that far back, if you took botany in college. Carl Linnaeus was largely known for his classification of plant life. He's known as the father of taxonomy. But Carl Linnaeus did not only classify plant life, he also tried his hand at classifying people. And here were some of our earliest categorizations of people by color, or what we now know as racial categories. So I'm going to give you a second to look at this and walk through it a little bit. So we see that Carolus Linnaeus divided people into this group: Amerinds, Europeans, East Asians, and Africans. And we won't get into this last monstrosus category. Michelle, did you want to jump in? Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to call you out. So we won't get into this last category today. I think it reeks of ableism, and we could have a whole other presentation on these categorizations. But let's focus today on these racial categories. We see that first and foremost, Linnaeus categorized people by color. But he went beyond that, right? He went beyond that, and he also identified character attributes for people. So he didn't just stop with race. So you can see that he was a Swedish botanist, so he thought of his own race as being pale in terms of color. He also thought that they were muscular, swift, clever, and inventive, and governed by laws. So clearly he thought very highly of his own race, which would be today considered white. But then on the flip side, he identified Africans as Black, and also assigned several character attributes: slow, relaxed, negligent, and governed by impulse. So I'm going to pause here to see what jumps out at you when you look at this chart of these early racial categories. So while I'm waiting to see if y'all have reactions, one of the things that jumps out at me on this chart is just how familiar. Yep, it's disgusting. I agree. Everything is atrocious. Yep, agree with that too. And it's very narrow-minded. Absolutely. What's striking to me is that these racist stereotypes are still being used today. We can still turn on the TV or participate in a variety of media and see these racist stereotypes being used everywhere we look. Yep. Let me go back to my chat. Very upsetting. Yep. Use only positive attributes for Europeans. Yep. I mean, clearly Linnaeus thought very highly of his own race. And I think, one of the things I think is important to understand about race, and we'll talk a little bit about race making, particularly in the United States, is race really was created by and for white people. Originally Europeans, we didn't start using the terms white and Black until later, let's see. Aligns with the old medicine humors. Yep. And those were very incorrect. Yep. Coming out of the Greek system. As you said earlier, with real consequences. Absolutely. He also connects race to biology and wellness by including humors. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Any other reactions to this chart? So just to contrast this chart, I like to pull this quote from Perez Rodriguez and Fuente from 2017. And they say, of the genome of any two humans, 99.5 to 99.9% is identical. Sorry, I gotta move my pictures. Out of the 0.1 to 0.5% variation between any two unrelated individuals, the largest amount of variation, 85%, is between individuals within the same local population. So this is very much refuting what Linnaeus had come up with. And I should say that I don't think we can blame, nor are we blaming all of race making and racism on Linnaeus, but he was an instrumental figure in the beginning of this racial conceptualization as applied to humans. And I wanted to pull these couple of pictures to talk a little bit more about race as a social construction and not as biological, because I frequently have conversations with folks who say, well, there is some biological things that go on. Certainly people will bring up certain maladies, certain diseases that certain races are more susceptible to. And we'll talk a little bit more about all the things going on. But I like to show these two pictures to kind of demonstrate why we do see some correlation between disease and genetics and race. And to do that, I'm going to use this paint splotch picture as a metaphor for ancestry. So if we think of these paint splotches as genetic pools, we can see that people who are related to each other would be the different colors that we see in this ancestry, and how it's pretty much all mixed together, although the colors are more defined in certain areas. And then I'm going to show you this. So the idea here is these racial categories were created, again, by and for white people or Europeans at the time. And it was a structure that was loosely placed related to geography and skin color. And because it was related to geography, there are touches of ancestry within these racial categories, but it doesn't mean that race is biological. It means that we made this flawed racist system that we then overlaid on top of something like ancestry, which is of course genetically linked. And that's why we can sometimes see those correlations. It does not mean that race is biological, but it does mean that there can be some correlation between certain genetics and race. Now let me pause there in case there's any questions about this structure that I'm defining a little bit more.
Can you just repeat what you just said, the last part of what you just said?
That would mean I'd have to remember what I just said. Let me just briefly say it again. So if we think about the paint swatches as being genetic pools or ancestry, so let's say that my family resides in this red splotch down here at the bottom. Then we had Carl Linnaeus and other largely white people defining race and creating these categories that were overlaid very loosely on top of ancestry, defined based on geography. If we go back to that Linnaeus chart that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, you see that he was also identifying geographic area along with color and all of those character attributes. So we can see if going back to my chart, so we can see that if my family is part of this red splotch down here at the bottom, and then you overlay white as my category, which I am, you will then see that my family would all fall within these genetic, in this paint splotch that's down here. And it's not because race is a biological construction, but it does mean that there's some correlation between genetics, because ancestry and genetics is a real thing and is biological. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I just hadn't heard it from that perspective. I want to make sure I understood it correctly.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Okay, so Let's turn now a little bit more to focus on, if I hear a doggy. Natalia, I think I heard your doggy.
Sorry about that. I'm muted
No, no
now.
worries. No worries. No worries. So I want to turn now to this redefining of race and considering the hierarchy, because this leads us into how race and racism really cannot be separated. Now, to define racism as we get started, I'm going to play a short video by Amir Rahman. It's a stand-up act about reverse racism. And I'm going to have you pay attention and be ready after the video to share what jumps out at you in terms of how Rahman is defining racism in this video. So when we come back together, I'm going to ask you what jumped out at you, just to give you a warning. And I need to share my sound, and I need to optimize for video. All right.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amir. Hey, get on stage. You make your jokes about white people. You say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun dun dun? Reverse racism. I said, no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism. And I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and then, just for kicks, subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism. Naomi, thank you. You've been great. Good night.
Okay. As I'm changing my settings, I want to invite you all to either unmute or share in the chat what jumped out at you in this video. Ellen says truth. I agree. So as you are all processing, oh, here we got something. Colonial imperial arrogance that brought us to where we are in society. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Satirical facts, yes. It was a good way to talk about a controversial topic with comedy. Yeah, yeah, it's, oh, I like how he used humor to say these uncomfortable things. I agree. I never get tired. I can't tell you, I've probably seen this video clip hundreds of times, and I just appreciate not only that it's funny, but just how succinctly Rahman goes through these systems that have really created racism and contributed to racism and used racism to justify them in short order. He defines colonization, war, standards of beauty, all of these, I forget what he says, at every conceivable point, white people reaffirming that they are superior and using violence in a whole host of ways to affirm themselves as superior, and to justify war and this violence because of race. Reminds me of the Nasarema article. Oh, Amanda, I don't know that article. If you get a chance, I would love for you to put a link or more info in the chat for us. Okay. Anybody else have things that jumped out at them? So Rahman touches on this a little bit, but I think it's important to acknowledge that in the United States, well, first I'll say, so as this video is sort of alluding to, white supremacy and racism is a global phenomenon. So it is not something that just happens in the United States or just happens in some countries. We can see racism across the globe. However, it is unique in the United States in the way that we have continued to understand and participate in race making as a country. So even though it is a global phenomenon, I want to shift us now to look particularly within the US, but let me see, there's other, oh, thank you, Amanda. So Shajala says, also it shows how we have to sugarcoat race and racism for some to be comfortable with it. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, I mean, one of the takeaways of our conversation today is we have to be talking about race and we have to be talking about racism, because it doesn't stop if we don't talk about it. And there's really no way of combating it if we're not willing to acknowledge how it is working, particularly in biomedical research. Okay, and thank you, Amanda, for sharing that. I'm going to go look at that one after we're done today. All right, so let me give a definition of racism. And I'll say that if we were to go look at like the Merriam-Webster definition of racism today, it would not jive with what Rahman is describing. You can have reverse racism according to the dictionary definition of racism. It's usually just considered bias against somebody because of their race. But what Rahman is telling us is racism really only goes one way, going back to why race was formed in the first place. And again, that was to affirm and create the falsehood of white superiority. So I like this Anti-Defamation League definition of racism as opposed to the dictionary definition. And it says racism is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. So I think this is a very straightforward definition of racism that keeps us from getting into the conversation of, well, racism goes both ways. It really doesn't. Racism only impacts and hurts people of color, and it only benefits ultimately white people. Although we could get into ways that whiteness is performed not only by white people, but we'll see if we have time for that. So I now want to turn us to looking at the history of research and specifically biomedical research in the United States. So I'll start off by saying one of the ways that race has been used, particularly in the United States, is to justify racial violence, particularly to justify the enslavement of Africans and the stealing of indigenous lands, are two of the most prominent ways that race has been used as justification for violence against people of color. And those are not, of course, the only examples, but those are two of the largest. And so we have seen, particularly in biomedical research, a lot of work going into proving that race is biological, to proving that race is more than just something white people made up for their own benefit. And here on your screen, you're seeing some of the examples and ways that largely white men in the biomedical sciences have created to reaffirm not only race as a construct, but ultimately white supremacy. So some of you may be familiar with the pseudoscience of phrenology. For years, you had researchers who believed they could read the contours of the human head to decide things like who was intelligent and different character attributes, going back unsurprisingly to some of the character attributes that Linnaeus had described. Phrenology and the results of phrenology kept coming up to, like, surprise, surprise, we found that white people are the smartest again. And we found that people of color are deficient in these different ways based on our readings of the head. So phrenology has been debunked. You've probably all seen those models of skulls that are all mapped out that are in people's attics sometimes in terms of diagnosing people based on the contours of their head. This has been debunked, but it was an entire field created again to support this racism and white superiority. You're all probably familiar with eugenics, which was the idea of breeding people to create a superior human race. And unsurprisingly, what the white researchers who participated in eugenics thought were that ultimately white people and men and able-bodied and neurotypical people were the standard that we should all ascribe to. And so that was how they were using eugenics. Ultimately, it's a genocidal idea. And perhaps you do not know that the Nazis actually took the American research in eugenics and applied it to the Holocaust and the genocide of Jewish people. But it came from the US originally. And because of the Holocaust, that was what put a damper largely in the US researchers pursuing eugenics. But we still see hints of eugenics, even in biomedical research today. Things like intelligence testing, the IQ test in particular has been used again to support that white people are the smartest, and to show again and again their superiority and to affirm that superiority, which is false. And then this last one is a little bit different, but I think it's important in framing our conversation. So there is also a whole history of biomedical experimentation on people of color, particularly Black and Brown people. And I've cited, and I'll show the reference here at the bottom, but this book by Harriet Washington, Medical Apartheid, details that history, particularly medical experimentation on Black people in the United States. It of course includes Tuskegee, but it goes well beyond that. And I encourage, it's a hard book to read, but I encourage you to take a look at it. It's particularly surprising because Washington's book details this experimentation into the 90s. So it's not all historical or long history. Let's have something in the chat. Oh, Sayla says, great book. Okay, make that smaller. Okay. But the one example I wanted to give related to surgical and remedy testing was, some of you may be familiar with J. Marion Sims, who is known as the father of gynecology. J. Marion Sims was also a slave owner, and he perfected many of his surgical techniques on enslaved Black women. And he did that without using anesthesia. And anesthesia was available when he was performing these procedures on Black women. However, he and other medical researchers and professionals at the time believed that Black people did not feel pain to the same extent that white people did. And it of course was barbaric, but I think the reason that they believed this, or they needed to believe this, was it was very important for them as slaveholders in a country that's whole economy rested on enslavement of Africans, that they believed and they did the work to prove to the best of their ability this dehumanization of Black people and people of color more broadly. So part of that belief that Black people felt pain less was doing that work of dehumanizing to continue justifying this abhorrent violence.
There's also one more suggestion in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Also, Birthing a Slave by Marie Jenkins Schwartz. Oh, thanks, Shajala. I haven't read that one. I'm gonna hold up.
That talks about
copy
what
this
you were
one.
just talking about, the
Oh.
experimentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna copy the chat before we go today. All right. So I shared these couple examples to highlight two things that I think we have to be aware of and combating in biomedical research. The first is that race is a biological association. We have seen the work, even in these last examples we've discussed, where white biomedical researchers have developed entire fields to prove this biological association. And we know why they did it. They did it to justify all of this racial violence. And we'll talk a little bit about the implications we see today. The other thing we have to remember is that when we talk about race without racism, we tend to then apply a deficit lens to people of color. And I'll say more about this. So I've put it in an equation. Race minus racism equals a deficit lens. So oftentimes what we see in biomedical research today is the treating of race as benign categories, as if it doesn't matter which racial category you end up in, you have the same chance as everyone else at getting anything else. There's no disparate impacts based on what race you are. And of course, as we've been discussing, that ignores then this whole history of racism. It does matter which category you get put in terms of your health outcomes, and in terms of outcomes in almost every aspect of life, as we know from society, because it is a social construct. So what that allows us to do then, if we're thinking about race as if they are benign categories, is then we tend to start problematizing people of color, saying things like, well, what are people of color in this group doing wrong such that they have poor health outcomes, or whatever it might be? What are they doing wrong? If we think that race is a set of benign categories, then we are more likely to blame the people in that category for worse outcomes, if that makes sense. Let me pause here because I feel like I'm talking a mile a minute, and I just want to make sure I'm being clear. So let me pause to see if you all have comments, questions, reactions to what I'm describing. Okay. I'm going to move us on to show some examples, so we're not leaving these things behind. So first off, I want to look at the implications for race as a biological difference. So some of you may have read this article by Hoffman et al. From 2016. In that article, they show this chart, and I will describe it to you. Basically, they surveyed white people, both from the general public and then from first through residents of medical school. So what you're seeing in this chart over on the left-hand side are all of these myths about Black people. Now I have to make sure it's clear, everything in this left category is false. So these are all myths. And white medical students were asked if they believed these myths after their first year of medical school, second year, third year, and then as residents. So after they had completed their MD. And so up at the very top, we see that 23% of white people in the general public believe that Black people age more slowly than white people. 21% of medical students believe this after 1 year of medical school, 28% after second year, and then fast forward, 14% of residents, so practicing doctors, believe that this was true. So where the numbers are not quite as big, but I think are even more concerning based on what we've discussed so far, is this second category, where Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people's. 20% of white people surveyed believe this in the general public, 8% after 1 year of medical school, 14% after the second year, and then still 4% of residents believed that this was true. So we can start to understand why residents, people who have gone through medical school, white people who have gone through medical school still believe this. If these sorts of myths and the history that we've been discussing in biomedical research has never been discussed, and if we're not having honest conversations about race and racism, but the implications aren't just that these false beliefs are just sitting there within individuals. So to show you or to illustrate this, I have a quote from Soma Shekhar. A 2000 study out of Emory University found that at a hospital emergency department in Atlanta, 74% of white patients with bone fractures received painkillers compared with 50% of Black patients. Similarly, a paper last year found that Black children with appendicitis were less likely to receive pain medication than their white counterparts. And a 2007 study found that physicians were more likely to underestimate the pain of Black patients compared with other patients. Let me turn to the chat. As a medical student at a school in rural Alabama, that study was shocking. Yeah, absolutely. So we see how we can see in this example, not only the history, where this all started with J. Marion Sims and other biomedical researchers refusing to use anesthesia on Black people, and how these myths have perpetuated when they have never been addressed, not even in medical school, and they have very real implications for, in this case, Black people related to pain treatment. So I'll pause there in case there are other things that jump out at you or any reactions, comments, or questions that this brings up for you. Oops. So then I want to use this last example, which is just data I've pulled from the CDC related to COVID hospitalization based on race and ethnicity. Oh, my comment, Shajala says, this has been documented in the unequal treatment report about differences in treatment by race, even with similar SES and symptoms. Thank you. And thank you for that link as well. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to use this data to kind of have a discussion with y'all about ways this data is read when we just think about race as benign categories, and how it changes when we consider how racism is working. So what we see in this chart is that, and this data I know is not surprising to anybody here, that related to COVID hospitalization rates, we see that American Indian and Alaska Native, non-Hispanic Black people, and Hispanic or Latino people are vastly overrepresented in terms of hospitalization rates compared to non-Hispanic Asian or Pacific Islander and non-Hispanic white people. So if we look at this data and we think about race as benign categories, where it doesn't matter which category you're in, it doesn't have any impact on your health outcomes, this leads us to ask different questions, right? It leads us to say, gosh, what is happening that these certain groups of people of color have such higher hospitalization rates? Are they not wearing their masks? Are they gathering outside the home? Are they going to work on the front lines and things like that? Are they making bad decisions related to their health such that they're ending up in the hospital at such higher rates? So that's my poor attempt at an example of what it would be if we just thought race was a set of benign categories. But we ask very different questions if we consider racism too. Who is being forced to go and be our frontline workers because of the what we see in terms of disparities related to wealth, disparities related to access in terms of healthcare. These are the things that come up when we recognize how racism is working within these systems, such that certain groups of people of color have higher hospitalization rates. And to just take it a little bit further, I think the way we design studies will change if we're considering racism as well as just race. We know that the NIH now is requiring that we're considering racial groups. They want representation. And yes, these things are very important, but the NIH they haven't gone quite as far to say, you also need to be considering how racism works. And so we can abide by what the NIH is asking us to do, just considering racial categories as benign categories, and stay in line and get funded and carry out these projects without considering racism. But it leads us to ask different questions, to interpret the results very differently, if we are thinking of race as benign categories and not considering racism. Okay. Any other comments, questions, things that you're thinking about as I go through this example? And I'm not sure if I said this, but when we use race as benign categories, that is how the deficit lens works. That's problematizing the groups that are being impacted by systemic racism.
I think I agree definitely with what you say. That's really important in how we use race and ethnicity because of the victim blaming, right? Saying, oh, there's something wrong with this particular group of individuals. Right now, when I, as a Black woman, do research, I'm always looking for these things, right?
Yep.
Or if you happen to be diverse, like just extending it out to LGBTQ, people with disabilities, all those sorts of things, you're going to see it from a different lens. Unfortunately, we're generally not the ones that are always doing this research, right? And so I think a lot gets lost in translation, and then even getting things published, is an issue, right? I had a paper, they just wouldn't take the disparity. They just didn't get it. So I just had to, redo it and send it to Disparities Journal, because at least I didn't have to fight them over that, right? And so I think there's like the larger issue of even getting this information out appropriately is really difficult to kind of pull everybody else along.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's absolutely true. So one of the things that I found both at Colorado State, but then at other institutions that I've been at is most people that you interview, especially white people, but not only white people, cannot define race and in the way that we are defining it together today. They might not understand it's a social construction. Two, if they do, they don't recognize any hierarchy associated with it. So, and I work with people who are doing biomedical research, faculty and students. And if most people can't even define race, we have some very fundamental work to do. And I realize, most of the federal funding agencies and other leaders in healthcare and biomedical research, they can't define it either, or they don't realize that that's where the problem lies. And so, like, as Shajala is saying, we have to be educating, and it puts extra burden on the people who are understanding how it works, because you can't assume that reviewers or people reading it understand what race is. Like, you can't assume they understand the definition. In my work, I write myself blue, talk myself blue, by defining and redefining race and racism and white, like all of these concepts I use in my own work. It's a defining and a redefining, and it's it takes so many pages that I don't have to educate before I can even get to my own data and sharing my results. So yep. I think it's complicated. And the other thing I've noticed is that in biomedical research and in healthcare, I see a lot of folks promoting this cultural humility approach. And I don't think it's a bad approach. I mean, the idea behind it, if you're unfamiliar, is that you don't look at your own culture as being normal or superior, but just one way of being. But again, it doesn't consider power. It doesn't consider power structures or systems or the history of these constructs like race or gender or sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Any other thoughts? So I want to open up the conversation a little bit more to just hear from all of you in terms of how does this affect your research, or how might it affect your research? I always find this part of the conversation with biomedical researchers particularly interesting, because this is where it all comes out. You know, folks are like, well, we're still using race as a proxy for lung size, or, you know, I have this data set that's been going, a longitudinal study that's considered race as a benign category that started decades ago. And what do I do with this data now? So I would love for us to have a conversation about what this might mean or does mean for your own research and how you're doing the work now.
Well, I think it's complicated because I'm trained as a molecular biologist, but I also do public health work. And so as a biologist, to me, of course, no, we can't tell people's race. We can't look at somebody's genes and tell what race they are. No, like our name of what a race is, because race varies from country to country, right? But we do know in the United States that our race system is based on phenotype, right? Self-identity, phenotype. And then since we're socialized, we tend to consider ourselves what everybody else considers us, right? So there's a big connection to phenotype, which comes along with ancestry, right? Because I look like other people who are Black because we all have African ancestry, right? So they're going to be genes, are going to be systems that are going to be very similar, right? And I think what makes it hard to think, which I think are really important. So doing disparities work, looking at pharmacogenomics, looking at how people are acting towards different types of things, cigarettes, addiction, things like that. It's important to understand that there may be differences that cluster by ancestry, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but because we have this history of equating it with a bad thing, it's really difficult for us to consider it when we need to consider those biological factors, right? Because health is biology and environment and social environment and all those things. So I think it's really difficult to even think about that and talk about that. But to me as a biologist, it's really important because we can't think about health without thinking about biology. And it's not any different. Like you said, there are different things in different groups, right? There's Tay-Sachs, there's sickle cell, there's cystic fibrosis that are in different groups, right? But of course, everybody focuses on sickle cell, right? Those are generally people of color, right? So there's always that bias, that bent towards the predominant white population. And I think it's hard because I talk about this a lot with my colleagues in terms of needing to know, right? And in the United States, it aligns so well just because of the history of the United States, right? You know, it kind of really aligns with all the things that we're seeing. And I think COVID has thrust it out into the world. But people have known this for years. I mean, W.D. Du Bois, the 1900s knew this, right? We've always known that these differences have been there. But it also seems that, like you said, kind of going back to education, starting education on this, which is going to be hard. You know, I live in Texas. There's a war on critical race theory, which doesn't even happen in K through 12, but I digress, you know. And even now on professors, they want to target professors with tenure, you know, not getting tenure, things like that. But it just seems like it's something that's so essential to talk about. and to really educate people about, because we cannot think about health without thinking about those ancestral and biological things. It's just not going to work. We know people work different ways. We know based on our ancestry, we may have different reactions, not necessarily genes, but now epigenetics now, right? How our genes are expressed, when they're expressed, can affect all those things. But I really don't know the answer to that, but I think it's something that's really important to think about and consider as a biologist myself, because when I did my MPH, they didn't talk about biology at all. I'm like, it's impossible, it's health. There's some kind of link between these social factors and these biological systems that are affecting health, right? And so that's kind of how I see it, because I use it in mine. I usually just say self-identified, right? Self-identified, race and ethnicity. I don't do genetics work anymore. So I don't really go into the ancestry about it. But I think that there is power in kind of understanding how these things work and how to separate them from historically what we thought about them, or how they're working, like what the myth has been, right, to like what we know now.
Right. Or even beyond separating them, acknowledging the context that they cannot be removed from, right? Like, I think, yeah, what you're describing is so important, and it's dangerous when we're not willing to talk about race. It's also dangerous when we're not going to consider how racism is working. So, I mean, that's one of the big takeaways of our discussion today, is just, are we asking that question, particularly in a climate where we see a lot of state public health organizations coming out with these statements about racism as a public health crisis, but there's still a disconnect in terms of, well, what is that meaning then in the research that we're doing? How is that getting into the people who are deciding what questions to ask, how to interpret the data, et cetera, to just, like, I think, reinforce some of the points you're making. We have to also take that extra step to say, yes, let's talk about it, and let's also talk about all of it. Let's not just talk about the parts we're comfortable with. And when I say we, I'm meaning white people generally. Other thoughts, other things that this means for you, or ways that y'all might be combating some of this in your own work. The other thing that I've found interesting in a lot of the conversations I have with biomedical researchers, so I'm a social scientist, and so it's interesting having conversations with very different training, but also realizing that we need to start, if we're going to all agree, yes, race is a social construct, then we actually should be involving people who do research in the social sciences to get that perspective. Because it does seem like oftentimes we're leaving that out. And I have to say, and of course I am biased as a social scientist, but it does seem like the biomedical sciences and healthcare always want to solve the problems themselves and don't think anybody else can participate in that. So I think that's how we end up with these cultural humility models that are nice, but there are other fields that have gone way past that that we could be engaging to take a more critical and more useful approach. So, and disclaimer, that's my bandwagon, so or my soapbox. But let's see. Well, I don't want to hold you all if you don't have any other things to share, although I also don't want to cut you off if you have any other last examples. as I'm letting you think about that, I do want to share here where I think I caught all of the references and added a couple more in there. This Sean Harper piece is focused on higher education research, but I think it does a very nice job of describing the consequences for considering race without racism, and can apply to biomedical research as well. So, any last questions or thoughts on any of the things that we've discussed today?
So I do more education research, and we're at a Hispanic serving institution. And so we really want to serve our students and not just enroll them and graduate them. And so there's a lot of discussion about what you were saying about, you know, a lot of people I think say, well, it's the students' fault, like they're unprepared, there's blah, blah, blah. And that might be because of, you know, where they grew up or what resources they had access to growing up, right? It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their skin color per se, except for all of the history associated with that. And so like we really try and think hard about, so nevertheless, these are our students and they are here. And so what do we do to fix the university? Like think of it as the university is broken, that we're unable to do a good job serving our students. So how are we going to fix that versus like fix the students? And so that's kind of what I'm always trying to think is like, what can I do better? What can I do to reduce barriers or minimize challenges that hopefully will then be inclusive and like help all of my students, right? And so I don't really know how that translates into more biomedical work. So that's just something I've been thinking about as you've been talking, is I'm having a hard time envisioning quite the parallel there.
Yeah. No, I think this is a great question and one that is top of mind for me at CSU as well in my role as the Assistant Dean of DEI. I mean, one of the things and one of the ways that I think our conversation applies to that in particular is we in higher ed need to be also acknowledging racism as well. And we don't tend to do that. We don't tend to pay attention to the ways that we are pushing out certain students of color and first gen. We focus all of it on how are they not prepared for this, that, and the other, instead of saying, we're actually actively pushing out students. Racism is happening in the classrooms, and I've done some classroom research on this and have examples that I could share other references with you as well. But I think it's very important that we look at it from that perspective, ask the same question in higher ed and say, how's racism working? Because we know it is. So how is racism working to keep some students out and push some students out even when they get in here? So in higher ed, we tend to focus solely on recruitment of students of color, and we're not focusing on retaining those students. You know, one of the arguments that I feel I have almost daily is we need to focus on creating a climate where we know all of our students can thrive. And until we have that climate, it's irresponsible for us to be recruiting and trying to present to disenfranchised communities that they can be successful here, because we don't believe it ourselves. So just looking at the ways that classrooms are designed, I think we also have to look at what are we saying students need, and do they really need that to succeed in what we say they are going to succeed in? I think there's also a whole question around what is success. Success for whom? Because students tend to define it differently than we do. Right. Yep. Exactly right. But some of my research has looked at college algebra as a gatekeeper course, and how many students we make take college algebra that really don't need it. that aren't using it in what they go on to do. And if we can't show, I think we have the responsibility to show all students, but particularly students from disenfranchised communities, how they can use every class they're taking to get to what they want to do to achieve their career goals. I think we should hold ourselves responsible for that, because those gatekeeper courses are one of the ways that we see, I mean, a pipeline as a metaphor is really pretty disingenuous, because we know that it's just spraying out at all these different junctures. And so, you know, Eben McGee who's a race researcher in higher ed, says like, if the K-12 or the college pipeline for students of color in STEM were in your house, you'd call a plumber because you would have a flood, right? Like it's not a pipeline. It's not, most of the things aren't going to that next juncture, or most of the people in this case aren't.
If you were a biomedical person, you'd be having a hemorrhage.
That's right. That's right. It's not a good metaphor, because that's not what's happening. Yeah. So I think those are some of the things that we need to start with, especially for those of us who, like CSU is hoping to be an HSI in the future. We're not quite there yet, but focusing on what is this climate like? How are the Hispanic students who are here experiencing it, and the other students of color, before we try to focus on bringing more students of color here.
I totally agree. I'm at a Hispanic serving institution, and particularly after COVID, like now, our students were not as prepared. 60% transfer in from community college, which means we're not getting that first time in college money. So there's a big focus on enrollment, but at the same time, they're enrolling people who are not ready for college. And if they're going to do that, we need to bring back remedial stuff, right? Because you're bringing these students and promising them this, and you're cheating them, and they're students of color, so they're already behind the 8 ball. And then as faculty of color, when students get upset, we're getting the grunt of the bad evaluations of, you know, the behavior in class, and they wonder why we won't stay. It was like, because it doesn't, it's not helpful. And even as a teacher myself, as a professor myself, when my students don't learn, that affects me emotionally. You know, it affects me emotionally because these are students of color and I already know what they have to go through, because I want my students to do well. And we've been trying to, like, we need the support. If you want the students here, we need support, not a tutoring center. You know, we need basic support. And if you're not going to do that, then you need to not let these students in. But they will never do that because they want the enrollment money, right? I just realized that, like, maybe, you know, a couple of months ago, when it really hurt my heart, because I expect it from a big private university, you know, but for us, we're sending these students out unprepared, because there are faculty members like me, like, you have to do your work. I'm going to help you as much as I can. And then there are other professors who let them pass through. So when they get to us, mostly the students, the faculty of color and the women, they're livid because they actually have to do something correct, and all that kind of affects. It's a whole system. And so that's why I've been telling our administrators, you're not going to get, if you're not inclusive with your faculty, then you can't be inclusive with your students. Right? Like you can't do it, because you need to retain faculty of color, quality faculty of color for all the students, right? So if we don't feel comfortable here, it's going to be hard for us to deal with all that we have to deal with, you know, teaching our students and getting what they need and trying to do everything, you know, and everybody knows we don't do it for the money. So, you know, and so it's kind of a cycle and a system. But even in a Hispanic serving university, most of the admin, well, not all the admin, there aren't as many faculty of color that you think. Like I've adjuncted to HBCUs, there's not a lot of Black faculty members at HBCUs, you know, so we're looking at diversity, but not looking at the wealth of diversity there, I think, is going to be, especially now with COVID kind of pushing us even more towards that enrollment. That's just, they're offering free summer classes. I'm like, they don't need to take summer classes. They can't take semester classes, you know, and not thinking about what effect that has on the students, and also ultimately on the reputation of my school if they come out and they don't know how to do anything, or if we're not graduating a certain percentage of our student population. So it's a constant battle.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, the same thing is true for faculty and staff in higher ed as well. What sort of climate are we asking our colleagues to survive in? Because like we're not nearly to thrive in. We're just you know, we're just asking our colleagues of color to survive in these environments. And we also see that pipeline is non-existent too. You know, leadership just gets, even when, you know, in the College of Vet Med, we're mostly white women students, but you still see as you go up in terms of tenure and then into administrators and leadership, the whiter it gets and the more men you get. And that's true in almost any higher ed structure you look at. You just look at the data and there's the same thing happening. So yeah, we can't handle those things separately or think that we can isolate one or the other, like, oh, we'll just focus on the students and not worry about how our colleagues of color are experiencing this institution. No. Anyone else have any last thoughts? I could actually sit with you all day talking about these higher ed things. Oh, let me check the chat. Okay, Ellen said, it is challenging to promote equity and dismantle racism in the academy, which is historically hierarchical and has structural racism. I feel like it is difficult as research staff to really have much influence in our research agenda. Yeah, I feel that. Yeah, especially when these conversations are so basic. It always surprises me when people say things like, oh, I just didn't think that this was a problem or this is a problem anymore. I'm like, what has ever happened that you would think that problem would stop? Like, point to one thing that would say like, this is how it was resolved. I'm like, you know, okay. Oh yeah, Shajala, you were just talking about being in an HSI. Yeah. All right. Well, any last comments?
Thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Really appreciated the conversation. And I think Amy will share the link to the slides so you can grab those resources. And then, oh, and you've put a survey in there as well. And then, Amy, is there a way that we can capture the links that were shared in the chat?
Yeah, I can download the chat and send that out.
Okay,
As part of,
cool. Because I would love to see, to go and see some of those resources that you all provided. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I appreciate our time together and thank you so much. Amy, is there any last things?
I was just working on dropping the link to the Prezi in the chat. And yeah, that webinar survey is only 3 questions or 4 questions. So please do take half a minute and fill that out for us. Very much appreciate you, Dr. Nishi. Thank you so much for this discussion today. Oh, Claire, Prezi is the software that Dr. Nishi used to make that presentation where it kind of flies around like that. That's Prezi. It's web-based. Bye, everybody.